All right, guys, this list was kind of hard to make because these wide receivers have been all over the place this year. There's all these quarterback injuries. How do we value these wide receivers with their quarterback being out and everything like that? So I got you. I've got a list here of rest of season rankings for the wide receiver position. Now, I'm not going to be going super deep. The main reason I'm making this list is because a lot of the wide receivers that are at the top, as far as where we value them in fantasy, have injuries to their quarterback. So I think it's very important that we figure out how we're going to be valuing all these wide receivers going forward. So I'm going to be giving you a top 25 list here. These are my rest of season wide receiver rankings. Let's go. First player on my list is going to be Tyreek Hill. This one's super obvious. He's got the floor. He's got the ceiling. He's getting 10 plus targets. He's getting 15 plus targets in a lot of these games. This dude's an absolute target hog. The big playability is second to none. Tyreek Hill is number one going forward. Next player on my list is going to be Keenan Allen. Now, Keenan Allen still has his quarterback. Justin Herbert's healthy. Mike Williams is out for the season. The situation couldn't be any better for Keenan Allen. This dude's averaging like 12 and a half targets a game. It's utterly insane. He's having one of the best wide receiver seasons freaking of all time, and it's getting overshadowed by Tyreek Hill because his season's so ridiculously good. But Keenan Allen is having an all-time wide receiver season. You're starting him every week. Next player on my list is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, this is a guy who he hasn't had a single bust game this season. I mean, the lowest he got as far as your overall fantasy performance was 14 PPR points. This dude is fed targets like crazy. He catches passes, out of the slot, but he's also able to catch the occasional deep ball. They've got him actually, running some routes downfield, and he had a 50-yard catch last week, 2 weeks ago. It was good to see. I mean, this dude catches passes at all levels of the field now. He's more dominant than he's ever been. Amon-Ra St. Brown is a freaking monster. He is a beast going forward. You're always going to play him every single week. Next player on my list is going to be A.J. Brown. This dude's been a freaking beast. Now, 125-plus yard games almost every single week. He's probably going to have another one versus the Chiefs tonight, although I have a strange feeling that Devontae Smith is going to be the guy in tonight's game. I don't know why, but a lot of you that are watching this video are watching after the Chiefs and Philadelphia game, so you probably already know the result of that, but I think that A.J. Brown is an absolute monster going forward, but I have some sort of hunch that Devontae Smith is going to have the bigger game tonight. Next player on my list is going to be Stephon Diggs. This guy's a freaking beast. Do not let the last 2 weeks make you think anything crazy. Don't think about trying to sell this guy. Don't think about, should I play this guy or not? Guys, it's Stephon freaking Diggs. We have a 4-year sample size with him and Josh Allen together, and this is one of the best connections in fantasy football, and it will continue to be going forward. Next player on my list is going to be CeeDee Lamb. This is my last tier 1 wide receiver. He still has his quarterback in Dak. This dude's been an absolute monster for the past month. He's got an outside shot to finish as the top 3 overall wide receiver in fantasy. This dude started slow, but he's been an absolute freaking monster. And he plays for my Dallas Cowboys, who everybody that watches my podcast, or most people know that I'm a Cowboys fan, but that really has nothing to do with this. This dude's a tier 1 wide receiver. Auto must start going forward. Now, going into my tier 2 wide receivers, we've got Justin Jefferson right here. Now, obviously, when it comes to talent, this dude's a high-end wide receiver 1. And I still think that he will sort of at some point creep back into my tier 1 wide receivers. But right now we need to see how he functions coming back from injury and how he functions with Josh Jacobs as his quarterback as opposed to Kirk Cousins. Because we all know that even though Josh Jacobs has been pretty good, he's probably not going to be as good for Justin Jefferson as Kirk Cousins was. But I still think Justin Jefferson will at some point creep back into my tier 1 wide receivers. But for now, he's the first wide receiver in tier 2, my number 7 overall going forward. Number 8 overall is going to be Tank freaking Dell. This guy has been amazing over the past 3 weeks. This dude's seen 35 targets over the past 3 weeks. And even though we've got some other wide receivers in this offense, all that does is make the overall efficiency of the offense better. This dude is like, he gets in the end zone, right? He's got the touchdown upside. He's got the target share and overall reception count upside, the yardage upside. This dude is lacking nothing. And there is no reason to just go ahead and not just plug him into your lineup every week. He's an auto must start going forward. Next player on my list is going to be Ja'Marr Chase. Now, Ja'Marr Chase obviously is not going to have his quarterback for the rest of the year. That's why I dropped him down into tier 2. I don't like doing this with a player as good as Ja'Marr Chase. But when we look at the situation realistically, he's not going to be as good as he was with Joe Burrow. There's just literally no way that happens. But he still can be a very good wide receiver going forward. I still think he's a top 10 overall option at the position. The target share is going to be there. It's just that, will this team be in the red zone as often? Will this offense be as good? Will he be able to connect with Ja'Marr Chase on the deep ball like Joe Burrow? Probably not. So he's not. I just don't think he's going to be the wide receiver that he was. But he's still a top 10 option going forward for the rest of the season. Next player on my list is going to be Davante Adams. I like the quarterback change here. I really do. I like going from Jimmy Garoppolo to Aiden O'Connell. The minute that Aiden O'Connell took over, Davante Adams is seeing a lot more targets, and I think that the new offensive coordinator probably has something to do with that as well. So Davante Adams is now being targeted the way he should. He's seen 26 targets in the past 2 games. Finally had that monster game that we were waiting for him to have this past week. I think that brighter days are ahead for Davante Adams. I have him as an overall top 10 play. Next player on my list, and this is when we're going to go ahead and drop down into tier 3, and that is Brandon Aiyuk. Now, this guy has a massive weekly ceiling, as we've seen. We saw it in week 1. We saw it this past week. The only problem is, what kind of consistency do we get in this offense? I mean, there are so many weapons that on any given week, we don't know who the guy's going to be. Is it going to be Debo? Is it going to be George Kittle? Is it going to be Christian McCaffrey? Is it going to be Brandon Aiyuk? Obviously, there's weeks where they can all go off, like this past week, McCaffrey, Kittle, and Aiyuk all had big games. But it's not going to be like that every week. And so given the weekly volatility, that's why he's a tier 3 wide receiver for me. But I still like him a lot going forward. Next player on my list is going to be Mike Evans. He's got a very good connection with Baker Mayfield. This dude is one of the best wide receivers of all time. He is quarterback proof. It doesn't matter who's slinging him the rock. The dude's an absolute monster. And I don't want to insult Baker Mayfield when I say that Mike Evans is quarterback proof. But, you know, he did have Tom Brady slinging him the rock before. We had Jameis Winston slinging him the rock, who we know is great for fantasy production. But his connection with Baker Mayfield is very, very good. And I had them as sleepers coming into this season, saying that people were sleeping on this offense. And, you know, they're not that great of a football team at the end of the day, but Mike Evans does produce for fantasy like he always has and obviously always still will. I don't ever see this guy not being fantasy relevant, and I have him as my 12th player overall. Next wide receiver on this list is going to be Chris Olave. Now, Chris Olave is a guy who, you know, if you look at his ADP, if you look at where we drafted him, in the majority of like redraft leagues and ESPN leagues, he's definitely returning his ADP. Now, I had such high hopes for Chris Olave going into this season that I'm a little bit disappointed. And in my mind, he's been a slight bust because I wanted him to be just an absolute freaking monster, which he isn't. But if you look at where we took him in his ADP, he's still returning value, right? So he's still a good player going forward. We still got him at a good price, and he is producing for us. And you're never not going to have this guy in your lineup. Next player on my list is going to be DJ Moore. He has the floor. He has the ceiling. He's Justin Fields dependent. But we've seen it all year. You know, as long as Justin Fields is slinging him the rock, he's got a solid floor and a very, very high weekly ceiling. So I like DJ Moore going forward. Next player on my list is going to be Devontae Smith. I think he's going to have a big game tonight against the Chiefs. We're going to see. With that being said, when it comes to pure talent, this dude is a wide receiver 1, right? So you've got a true wide receiver 1 as far as talent is concerned and one of the best offenses in the NFL. But this just goes to show the importance of being the number 1 wide receiver in your offense, right? Like if A.J. Brown was not on this team, Devontae Smith would be an absolute freaking monster. But when you're the number 2 option on your team, you just don't get the kind of target share you need to be consistent on a week-to-week basis, but you're always going to have the ceiling. So when you're playing Devontae Smith, I can't ever get myself to bench him, and that's what upsets me because there's been some games where he's been a total bust, but I just can't ever not have this guy in my lineup. And going forward, I'm probably going to continue to have him in my lineup every single week. Next player on my list is going to be DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf is, you know, the athletic specimen of the NFL, right? This dude is, you know, he's a good football player, and he gets, you know, the majority of the targets on his team. But, you know, this year, you know, is he really as consistent as we want him to be? No, not really. Does he really give us the ceiling that we want him to have? No, not really. He's just always been one of those guys that you know has extreme potential, but never really lives up to it in being that, you know, high or mid-range wide receiver 1. I don't really think he's ever going to be that for whatever reason, but at the end of the day, he is good enough to be in your starting lineup every single week. Next player on my list is going to be Jalen Waddle. Now, Jalen Waddle is a guy who is underperforming massively. He's actually starting to upset me. I really had higher hopes for Jalen Waddle going into the season because if you look at last year, the target share between him and Tyreek Hill was pretty similar, but Tua clearly decided to favor Tyreek Hill this year, and it's working very well for the offense. I don't think that game plan is changing anytime soon. I think that Jalen Waddle is, you know, a little bit overhyped on a weekly basis. I don't think he's a must start every single week. I think that after DK Metcalf here is when we get into the category where these players aren't really necessarily must starts. You know, you look at Jalen Waddle, you look at the offense that he plays in and the talent, and you think to yourself, I can't possibly have this guy on your bench. But what production has he really given you? He's only had one game with more than 20 points, PPR points. I really don't think you have to start this guy every week. Next player on my list is Cooper Kupp. Now, Cooper Kupp gets hurt in this game. When's he going to come back from his injury? Is he ever going to be able to stay on the field? I don't know. Everybody knows how big I was on Cooper Kupp coming into the season, so it's really disappointing to see him continually get injured and not be able to stay on the field. Or if he is in the lineup, Matt Stafford isn't healthy. It's like, when are him and Matt Stafford just both going to be on the field and be healthy together? I'm starting to seriously doubt that that's ever going to happen. And I'm not saying that it can't. So, Cooper Kupp is still an option that, if he gets 100% healthy and Matt Stafford gets 100% healthy, we're going to be playing them going forward, right? But I'm just starting to lose confidence in the fact that this guy can stay on the field. Next player on my list is going to be Nico Collins. Now, I really don't like having this much space between Nico Collins and Tank Dell because the target share in the offense is very similar. And I still think that there's going to be weeks where Nico Collins outperforms Tank Dell because he's got the talent level and he's still getting a pretty similar target share. But Tank Dell is just clearly the wide receiver one in this offense. But Nico Collins is still a top 25 option going forward. And he's borderline must start, but you can use your discretion on this. He's not an absolute must start. Next player on my list is going to be Michael Pittman Jr. Now, Michael Pittman Jr. has had a very good season. Obviously, Anthony Richardson is, still out, but, the target share is consistent, right? I like Michael Pittman going forward, and, he's more of just a really good floor play who's consistent because of his target share, but the weekly ceiling isn't really there at all. Next player on my list is going to be Christian Kirk. Now, what in the world is going on with this Jacksonville offense? I mean, is Calvin Ridley the guy? Is Christian Kirk the guy? It's a very, very volatile offense on a weekly basis. Are they terrible? Are they awesome? They're Jekyll and Hyde, right? We really don't know what we're going to get with the Jaguars going forward, but what I've determined is this. They're a little bit matchup dependent. They're really not explosive enough to beat good defenses. We saw it against the 49ers. They were helpless. And then they played Tennessee, and they put up points on the board like crazy. So I think that the Jacksonville offense is a little bit matchup dependent. They're very hard to predict on a weekly basis, but I have Christian Kirk as the number one wide receiver in this offense going forward because he's just seemingly more consistent than Calvin Ridley. While Calvin Ridley has that massive weekly ceiling, Christian Kirk is more that guy that you can rely on every single week, which at the end of the day in fantasy is a lot more important because, those guys that only boom every now and then, they can put you in bad situations. Next player on my list is going to be Adam Thielen. Now, Adam Thielen was the wide receiver 3 overall in fantasy just like a month ago. I figured he would come crashing back down to earth a little bit because at the end of the day, he plays in a terrible offense, but the target share is super consistent. He's clearly Bryce Young's favorite target. So, going forward, he's definitely a guy that I wouldn't say is a must start, especially if you have, good wide receivers on your team. But really, despite the matchup, is going to get a consistent target share every single week and give you a very reliable floor. Next player on my list is going to be Calvin Ridley. This is the most frustrating player in all of fantasy this season. Everybody knows how big I was on Calvin Ridley going into the year, but at the end of the day, he's been hyper inconsistent. He's had 2 really big boom games and then really hasn't done much outside of that. So, what are we going to get with Calvin Ridley going forward? What do we think is going to happen on a weekly basis? The volatility makes it very hard to put him in your starting lineup. But obviously he has a very high ceiling. So, if you need a wide receiver, he's serviceable because of his weekly ceiling, but don't expect him to be consistent. Next player on my list is going to be Courtland Sutton. He's really emerged in this offense and been a good wide receiver. He's definitely Russell Wilson's favorite target. This is the vision that I had for Russell Wilson and Courtland Sutton when Russell Wilson first came to the team. It didn't come to fruition last year. It's starting to come to fruition now. I still want Courtland Sutton to be even better. I want Courtland Sutton to be a top 12 or 13 overall wide receiver because he's got that kind of talent. That being said, I don't know that the Broncos offense is good enough to actually give Courtland Sutton that kind of production, but he's definitely a top 25 play and somebody that you could start every single week. And he's actually been pretty consistent lately. Next player on my list, final player here is DeAndre Hopkins. Now, he plays in a terrible offense. That's the only reason he's not higher. This is still one of the most talented wide receivers in the NFL, even though he's a little bit older now. This dude is still a very good NFL wide receiver. And if he actually decided to go to a team that gave him a chance to win and actually had a good quarterback, he would be a monster. For whatever reason, he decided to go to the Titans. Obviously, he doesn't care all that much about winning a Super Bowl. But at the end of the day, it's DeAndre Hopkins. The talent alone is going to get you a decent weekly ceiling, decent weekly floor. He's definitely good enough to plug into your lineup every week, but don't expect him to really be a league-winning player. All right, guys, those are my top 25 players going forward. I'm about to go out of town for Thanksgiving, so I probably won't get at you guys until like Friday when I'm back in town because I got to go see some family, do some Thanksgiving stuff, watch some football, you know what I'm saying? But I wanted to give you guys this list. That way you know how we're valuing the wide receivers going forward, at least as far as the top 25. So if I left anybody off this list or if anybody's just completely in the wrong spot, don't be afraid to let me know. I'm always welcome to hear you guys' opinions, but I really think that this list is pretty solid as far as how we should be valuing these wide receivers going forward. So I hope this list helps, and I hope it helps with setting your lineup on a weekly basis. All right, guys, appreciate it. Catch you later.